What if it's a map of something we've forgotten? Under the bright lights of a museum, a small clay tablet sits quietly. The wedge-ship marks on it look normal, just another old record from ancient Mesopotamia. But when experts first figured out how to read it in the 1800s, they realized they were reading something impossible. It said that before the Great Flood, 8 kings ruled the earth for 241,200 years. These weren't legends passed down through families. These were poems meant to inspire people, but written down as fact with city names, family lines, and exact lengths of time pressed into clay, with the same careful care used for tax records and grain lists. Before we go deeper into this mystery, take a moment to like this video if you're interested in stories that blur the line between history and the impossible. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this quiet moment reaching across the world, connecting us all through the same ancient question. The story begins in the dust of Mesopotamia. In the late 1800s, people who dig up old things came to the flatlands of southern Iraq, places with names like Neper, Kish, and Lhasa. Their digs uncovered layer after layer of old civilization. Each layer was older than the one before it. Tablets came out of the ground stacked like frozen memories. Thousands of them, writing down everything from temple building to space. Observations to the price of barley. Among these countless clay pieces, one text stood apart. It wasn't a song to the gods. It wasn't a merchant's book or a king's brag. It was something stranger, a king list, a time-ordered record of rulers going back beyond memory, organized by city and family line, each rule carefully numbered. But the numbers made no sense. Before the flood, the text said kingship existed in 5 cities: Eridu, Badabir, Larak, Sipar, and Shurpak. 8 kings ruled. Across these cities, and their combined rule lasted 241,200 years. Then in a single line of text, everything changed. Then the flood swept over. After that line, the time suddenly got shorter. Kings ruled for decades instead of thousands of years. Cities rose and fell in normal human time. The text shifted from huge time periods to recognizable history. Family lines we can trace, battles we can date, kings whose monuments we've actually found. Experts immediately struggled with this. History prefers slow development, one invention building on another, cultures changing slowly from simple to complex. But the Sumerian King List doesn't follow that rhythm. It shows history in 2 separate eras, separated by disaster. Before the flood, impossibly long rules. After the flood, normal human history. The traditional explanation dismisses the pre-flood section as pure mythology. Blown up numbers meant to make later kings seem more important. Just ancient propaganda, nothing more. But then something unsettling happened. As people who dig up old things dug deeper into the cities named in the King List, they found something they didn't expect. At sites like Kish and Shurpak beneath the earliest history levels, they discovered thick layers of clean flint mud, what left clay containing no objects, no pottery, no signs of human activity, just a rock signature of massive flooding. The flood wasn't just a metaphor. It was real. And the King List structure, its sharp division between 2 eras, suddenly matched the physical break in the ground itself. Meanwhile, the same civilization that made this confusing document appeared seemingly overnight around 3500 BC. The Sumerians showed up with fully formed writing, smart mathematics, city planning, and space knowledge that matches what we only confirmed with modern telescopes. There's no visible early version, no slow invention, no slow build-up from simple to advanced. They simply appeared. Already complex. And when you read their own texts closely, something becomes clear. They never claimed to invent civilization. They claimed to restore it. Their writings speak of kingship coming down from heaven, of temples built on the foundations of earlier temples, of knowledge inherited from before the flood. Imagine holding one of those tablets in your hands. The clay still carries the marks of fingers that shaped it over 4,000 years ago. Each wedge-ship mark was pressed carefully, step by scribes who believed they were saving something important, not creating fiction, but saving memory. The writing system itself, cuneiform, wasn't just about sounds. It was geometric triangles, lines, and angles arranged to hold both sound and meaning. Through these marks, the Sumerians recorded medicine, law, astronomy, mythology, and business. One tablet tracks the movements of Venus with accuracy we only confirmed in the 1900s. Another describes Jupiter's path across the night sky. Another calculates complex multiplication using base 60 mathematics. The same system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. This wasn't the hesitant work of a new civilization finding its way. This was refinement. And then there are those pre-flood numbers. They've bothered researchers for over a century, because while 241,200 years is clearly not a real time span for human rulers, the numbers aren't random either. Many are exact multiples of 3,600, a Sumerian unit called a sar, used in space calculations to measure sky cycles. What if these weren't life stories? What if they were time periods? Time measured not in human lifespans, but in ages, cosmic intervals that the scribes put into the only format they had, a king list. The pattern becomes even stranger when you look beyond Mesopotamia. Egypt's Turin papyrus lists divine rulers who governed before the pharaohs with rules lasting thousands of years. Hindu texts describe 4 great ages, yugas, lasting hundreds of thousands of years, ending in disaster and renewal. Greek mythology speaks of multiple ages of man, each destroyed and replaced. Mesoamerican cultures recorded multiple worlds destroyed by flood, fire, and wind. Everywhere the structure repeats, divine or semi-divine rulers, huge time spans, disaster by flood, new cycle beginning with shorter human lifespans. How could cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years remember the same pattern? At the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a Sumerian cylinder seal sits behind protective glass. Among its dedication writings, one phrase stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not invention, not discovery, restoration. That single word means memory, that even the Sumerians themselves understood they were heirs to something older, something that came before their own beginning. Sometimes if you look closely at these ancient tablets, you can still see the fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the unique swirls and ridges of someone who lived 6,000 years ago. A scribe who perhaps copied this king list from an even older source, saving fragments of a world they only half understood. Those fingerprints feel like a pulse from another age. A heartbeat frozen in mud reaching across thousands of years to remind us that history isn't always a straight line forward. Sometimes it's circular. Sometimes it's interrupted. And sometimes what we call the beginning is actually the part that survived the ending. The silence between those ancient lines feels heavy, as if something huge has been taken away. The way a missing verse can haunt an entire song. The way a forgotten dream hovers at the edge of waking. Maybe that's why the Sumerian King List still whispers to us. It suggests that what we call human history might only be the latest chapter, not the first, that our timeline begins not at the dawn of civilization, but after civilization amnesia, after something was swept away and only partially remembered. At night, when museums close and lights dim, I imagine those clay tablets breathing quietly in the darkness, each one holding the compressed memory of a world that existed before ours, waiting for someone willing to question what beginning really means. We think of ourselves as the inheritors of progress, moving ever forward from primitive to advanced. But what if we're actually living at the end of a long forgetting? What if every discovery we make, every old site we uncover is less about finding something new and more about remembering something ancient? The Sumerian King List doesn't provide answers. It provides permission to ask whether our timeline is complete, whether the flood was just mythology, whether those impossible numbers point to something real that we've simply stopped knowing how to read. Because if this strange little tablet is not just fantasy, if it's putting real-time periods in the only language its scribes had, then we have to ask a more unsettling question. What kind of world was it trying to remember? To understand what the King List is really telling us, we need to read it the way the Sumerians organized it, not as continuous history, but as 2 separate worlds separated by disaster. The text opens with a line that has puzzled scholars for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was an Eridu. That phrase descended from heaven appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian business documents. It's not the language of paperwork. It's the language of cosmic transfer of something handed down from above. And then immediately after this statement, the list begins its careful cataloging. First Eridu, a king named Alum rules for 28,800 years. Then Alunga for 36,000 years. The kingship moves to Bat Tubir. 3 kings ruled there across 108,000 years. Then Larak for 28,800 years. Then Cypher for 21,000 years. Finally, Shurpak, where Ubatutu, father of the flood hero Sudra, rules for 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, a combined total of 241,200 years. And then in a single devastating line, the text breaks. Then the flood swept over. After those words, everything changes. The list starts again, but in an entirely different way. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. Notice the structure. Kingship descends again. As if it had been stopped, as if the cosmic order needed to be set up again. But now the numbers shrink dramatically. The first king of Kish after the flood, Gor, rules for 200 years. Still impossibly long by our standards, but a fraction of what came before. His successor rules for 960 years, then 840, then 420. Within a few generations, we're down to rules of 30, 25, even 11 years, time spans that feel recognizably human. The list continues through familiar family lines. Kish, Uruk, Urin, Hamazi, Akkad. These are cities we've dug up. Kings whose monuments we found, battles recorded in multiple sources, history as we understand it. The flood isn't shown as moral punishment or divine anger. It's shown as a timeline marker, the hard boundary between 2 separate eras of existence. Before it, rules stretched across huge time periods. After it, rules compressed into lifetimes. This structure alone is strange enough, but then people who dig started digging. In 1929, British person who digs Sir Leonard Woolley was digging up the ancient city of Ur, one of the great Sumerian capitals mentioned a lot in the post-flood section of the King List. His team had been working through living layers, each layer revealing pottery, tools, and building remains from older and older periods. Then about 40 feet down, they hit something unexpected. A layer of clean water left mud over 8 feet thick. No objects. No pottery pieces, no ash from fires or pieces of walls, just clean clay, the rock signature of disaster flooding. Beneath that flood layer, they found earlier living, older pottery styles, different building foundations. Human activity, then flood, then human activity started again above it. Woolley was convinced he'd found evidence of the biblical flood. Whether or not that's true, he definitely found evidence of a flood, one massive enough to leave rock traces and stop the continuity of city life. But it wasn't unique. Digs at Kish in the 1920s showed a similar flood layer, 5 feet of mud separating earlier living layers from later ones. At Shurpak, the last pre-flood city in the King List, people who dig found an even more dramatic break. A thick band of river clay left by violent flooding, clearly separating older settlement layers from what came after. Not every site showed flooding at exactly the same depth or from exactly the same time. Mesopotamia experienced multiple disaster floods over thousands of years, but the pattern held. Major Sumerian cities showed rock evidence of severe flooding that matched breaks in cultural continuity. The King List's story structure, its sharp division between before and after, wasn't Marduk mythology. It matched an actual break visible in the rock record. This creates an unusual situation. Most ancient flood myths, Noah, Deucalion, Manu, are understood as symbolic or moral tales, warnings about pride, divine judgment, the weakness of human civilization. They're not expected to have physical matches in the ground. But the Sumerian King List doesn't read like a moral tale. There's no judgment declared. No explanation given for why the flood came. No hero's journey or redemption story. It simply states, these kings ruled in these cities for these lengths of time, and then the flood swept over, and then kingship started again in a different city with different time scales. It reads less like mythology and more like data saving, an attempt to keep time order across a civilization break. Consider how the text treats the flood. It doesn't dwell on it. Doesn't describe rising waters or desperate survivors or divine anger. It gives exactly one line to the event itself. Then immediately returns to its record-keeping function, cataloging family lines. This is the language of record-keeping, not storytelling. The flood works as a divider, the way we might mark BC and AD, a fixed point that divides time into before and after, needing no further explanation because everyone already knows what happened. That assumption that the audience already understood what the flood meant suggests it wasn't a mythological idea. It was shared historical memory vivid enough to need no elaboration. The post-flood section reinforces this. The cities listed, Kish, Uruk, Lagash, Amma, are all confirmed dig sites. Many of the later kings are proven in multiple independent sources. We found their writings, their building projects, references to them in diplomatic letters with other kingdoms. The King List's post-flood time order, while still containing some uncertainties and overlapping family lines, basically works as history. Imperfect, yes, but recognizable as an attempt to organize real political succession across real city-states, which makes the pre-flood section even more confusing, because the text doesn't distinguish between the two eras in style or format. It treats both with the same paperwork precision, same structure, same matter-of-fact tone, same careful notation of city names and rule lengths. If the post-flood section is historical record and digging confirms it largely is, then what is the pre-flood section? Pure invention added onto real data or something else? Here's what makes dismissal difficult. The pre-flood cities are real places, too. Eridu's dig layers go back nearly 8,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously evident sites in Mesopotamia. That Tubir has been identified with modern Tel al-Medina. Shurpak, the last pre-flood city, is Tel Far, and its flood layer is among the most dramatic found in any Sumerian site. These weren't imaginary locations. They were actual city centers lived in for thousands of years before the earliest writing appeared. The King List remembered them as ancient even in ancient times, places where kingship, whatever that meant in pre-writing eras, had once existed. But then we're back to those numbers. 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. If the flood is real, if the cities are real, if the structure matches actual rock and cultural breaks, then what are we supposed to do with rules that span tens of thousands of years? The usual answer is nothing. They're symbolic, blown up to make their civilization seem more important, the product of scribes who wanted to make their civilization seem eternal, rooted in cosmic time, rather than human time. But that explanation has always felt incomplete. Because if you wanted to invent an impressive origin story, why include the flood at all? Why create a heartbreak that divides your eternal past from your ordinary present? Why not just claim continuous divine kingship stretching back forever? The structure itself, 2 years, disaster division, sudden shift in time scale, suggests something more complex than propaganda. It suggests an attempt to save a memory of actual break, even when that memory included elements that no longer made normal sense. The Sumerian scribes who put together this list weren't fools. They were smart record keepers who kept vast libraries, tracked sky movements, and managed complex money systems. They understood time, succession, and historical recording. So when they recorded pre-flood rules in these huge numbers, they must have had a framework for understanding them, even if that framework is now lost to us. What if those impossible rules weren't meant to be human lifespans at all, but markers of something else entirely? Let's look at those numbers again, but this time not as impossibilities to dismiss, as patterns to decode. Alulum of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alunga of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmanluana of Bat Tubira, 43,200 years. Enangalana of Bat Tubira, 28,800 years. Demuzi of Bat Tubira, 36,000 years. At first glance, these figures seem random. Absurdly large numbers chosen randomly to show oldness. But look closer. There's a math precision here that randomness doesn't explain. 28,800 appears twice. 36,000 appears twice. These aren't scattered across a range of mythological inflation. They're careful repetitions. And when you start calculating their relationships to each other, something remarkable shows up. The Sumerians didn't count the way we do. Well, we use base 10 decimal, organizing everything around powers of 10. They use base 60, a sexagesimal system that seems strange to us, but offered amazing math flexibility. This is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't random, they're Sumerian inheritances so deeply built into our timekeeping and geometry that we barely notice them anymore. In this system, certain numbers held special importance. The most important was the sar, a unit equal to 3,600 or 60 multiplied by 60. The sar appears throughout Sumerian mathematics, but it had a particular space use. It was used to measure large sky cycles, the kind of cosmic intervals that couldn't be expressed easily in human years. Now look at the King List. Builds through this lens. 28,800 equals 8 multiplied by 3,600, 8 sar. 36,000 equals 10 multiplied by 3,600, 10 sar. 43,200 equals 12 multiplied by 3,600, 12 sar. 21,000 equals 5.83 multiplied by 3,600, close to 6 sar. 18,600 equals 5.17 multiplied by 3,600, just over 5 sar. The pattern is unmistakable. These aren't random inflations. They're multiples, some exact, some approximate, of a basic space unit. The pre-flood rules are being expressed in the language of sky mathematics, not life story time order. This distinction matters deeply because once you recognize these numbers as SAR units, they stop being nonsensical lifespans and start being something else entirely, time markers of a different scale. The Sumerians were obsessed with the sky. Their priests tracked sky movements with careful precision, recording the positions of Venus over years, noting the first risings of stars, calculating lunar months and solar years. Clay tablets from later Babylonian astronomy, direct descendants of Sumerian practice, show calculations of planetary synodic periods, eclipse cycles, and even the precession of the equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis, that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. They understood that the heavens moved in patterns, repeating cycles that could be measured, predicted, encoded. The SAR was part of this cosmic vocabulary, a way to express time intervals that went beyond human lifetimes. So when a pre-flood king is listed as ruling for 36,000 years 10 sar, we might be looking not at a life story claim, but at an epoch marker, a cosmic interval, an age. Consider how this reframing changes the text. Instead of reading Alulum ruled for 28,800 years, we might be reading something closer to during the time period of Alulum or in the 8th sar, or in the age associated with Alulum lasting 8 cosmic cycles. The kings become labels for eras rather than individuals. Their rules become the lengths of ages rather than lifetimes. And suddenly the King List transforms from a failed attempt at biography into a successful attempt at something else. The cosmic calendar compressed into the only format available, a King List. This wasn't unprecedented in Sumerian thought. Their worldview didn't separate kingship from cosmic order. Kings weren't just political rulers. They were representatives of divine authority, go-betweens between heaven and earth, maintainers of me, the basic laws governing existence. Kingship itself was understood as a cosmic principle that descended from heaven, not a human invention. In this framework, organizing time around kings doesn't necessarily mean organizing it around individual human rulers. It might mean organizing it around phases of cosmic order, each phase represented by a name that carries symbolic or family importance. The flood then becomes even more interesting. It's not just stopping human political succession. It's stopping cosmic succession. The carefully measured SAR intervals stop. The space calendar resets, and when kingship descends from heaven again, it does so in a new mode with new time scales that slowly compress toward human proportions. This interpretation gains support from what we know about later Mesopotamian astronomy. By the first 1,000 years BC, Babylonian astronomers were calculating cycles spanning thousands of years. The Saros cycle for eclipses 18 years, the Metonic cycle 19 years, and far longer periodicities. They understood that sky patterns operated on multiple time scales at the same time, from daily risings to the and year precessions. If their Sumerian predecessors thought similarly and the math precision of the King List suggests they did, then encoding long epochs in space units would have been a natural method of time organization. But there's another layer here. The specific numbers chosen aren't just any multiples of 3,600. Many match recognizable space periods when scaled appropriately. 43,200 for instance. 12 SAR is exactly half of 86,400, the number of seconds in a day, another trace of base 60 thinking. It's also close to important lunar and planetary period calculations that show up in later Babylonian texts. 28,800, 8 SAR relates to certain Venus cycles. The planet Venus, which the Sumerians called Inanna and tracked obsessively, has an 8-year synodic period, after which it returns to nearly the same position relative to Earth and the Sun. Multiply that by 3,600, and you get time intervals measured in Venus cycles rather than human years. Could the pre-flood kings encode something even more specific? Not just generic epochs, but epochs measured by particular sky events. Eras defined by Venus alignments, Jupiter positions, or other planetary configurations that ancient astronomers thought were important. We can't know for certain. The space texts that might explain the King List's number system haven't survived, if they ever existed in written form. But the math structure itself argues for intentionality. These numbers weren't meant to be believed as life ages. They were meant to be decoded by people who understood the space language in which they were written. Meanwhile, this pattern organizing deep time into huge epochs, each lasting thousands or tens of thousands of years, appears in other ancient traditions with striking consistency. The Hindu concept of yugas divides cosmic time into 4 vast ages. The Satya Yuga 1,728,000 years. Treta Yuga 1,296,000 years. Dwapara Yuga 864,000 years and Kali Yuga 432,000 years. Notice those numbers. They're all multiples of 432,000, and they're all expressed in the same base 60 math language that structures the Sumerian King List. Greek tradition spoke of successive ages: golden, silver, bronze, heroic iron, each representing a decline from an earlier perfection, each ending in disaster and renewal. Mesoamerican cosmology recorded multiple suns or world ages, each lasting thousands of years and ending in destruction by flood, fire, wind or earthquake. These systems differ in details, but they share a basic structure: cosmic time organized into separate epochs, each vastly longer than human lifetimes, separated by disaster transitions. We'll explore these parallels more deeply later, but for now, the pattern suggests something important. The Sumerian King List isn't an isolated oddity. It's part of a broader ancient practice of encoding deep time in mythological or space frameworks. The question becomes why? Why did ancient cultures across the world feel the need to organize time this way? Why not just record recent history and leave the distant past unmeasured? Perhaps because they remembered or believed they remembered that human history was interrupted, that there were ages before this one, that the world had been reset. Knowledge had been lost and what survived was fragmentary. The King List in this reading becomes an attempt to save time order across that break, to keep cosmic order by remembering, however imperfectly, what came before the flood. To say we know there were ages before ours. We know they lasted a certain length. We know they were real even if we can no longer experience them directly. The pre-flood numbers don't describe impossibly long-lived individuals. They describe remembered time itself, stretches of existence measured by sky cycles, organized around symbolic figures, encoded in the only number language smart enough to express such hugeness: base 60 space mathematics. If these numbers point to ages instead of men, then where did those ages play out? And what kind of cities belong to them? If the pre-flood section of the King List encodes actual epochs rather than impossible lifespans, then we should be able to find those epochs in the ground in the cities the text names as seats of cosmic kingship before the flood swept over. 5 cities are listed: Eridu, Bad Tubir, Larak, Cyper, and Shurpak. Each supposedly held kingship for vast stretches of time before disaster erased that world and forced kingship to descend from heaven again. So, what do we find when we dig into these ancient places? Do they vanish into mythology, leaving no trace? Or does the earth itself remember? Let's start with Eridu, the first city named in the King List, the place where kingship descended from heaven, and where Alulim supposedly ruled for 8 cosmic SAR. Eridu sits in the far south of Iraq near what was once the edge of the Persian Gulf. Today, it's an empty mound rising from flat desert. But in ancient times, it was considered the most sacred site in all of Mesopotamia, the template from which all other temples were patterned, the birthplace of civilization itself. Digs in the 1940s and 1950s showed something amazing. Beneath the ruins of later Sumerian temples, people who dig found layer upon layer of earlier shrines. 18 successive temple structures built one on top of another on the same sacred mound, each separated by centuries of living. The deepest levels date back approximately 7,000 to 8,000 years, long before writing, before cities as we understand them, before the Sumerians even existed as a separate culture. Yet already in those earliest layers there was something structured: small mud brick shrines with offering platforms, careful alignment, evidence of ritual activity kept up across generations. The temples grew larger over time, more elaborate, more building-wise smart, but they never moved. Whatever made this spot sacred stayed sacred for thousands of years, as if each generation felt compelled to honor the place where something important had happened. Something so important it anchored religious practice for 8,000 years. The King List calls Eridu the first seat of kingship. Digging can't confirm kingship. That's an invisible social structure. But it can confirm that Eridu was treated as foundational, as primordial, as the axis around which early Mesopotamian culture organized itself. And those 8,000 years of living, that's actual deep time. Not the 28,800 years the King List assigns to Alulum, but still far longer than the brief span of recorded history. If the epochs in the King List were measured differently, compressed or encoded, then Eridu's digging depth at least points toward real oldness. Bad Tubir, the second pre-flood city, has been tentatively identified with the site of Tel Medina. But here the picture becomes frustratingly incomplete. The site has been only partially dug, and what remains is badly eroded. We know living existed there in early periods, but the details are sparse: fragmentary pottery, traces of walls, enough to confirm people lived there, but not enough to reconstruct what kind of society thrived there or for how long. Larak, the third city, is even more elusive. Its location remains uncertain, possibly modern Tel Awa, but the identification is contested. If that's correct, erosion and time have taken most of what would have been recoverable. The city exists. The King List is a name, a placeholder for an epoch, but in the ground it's barely a whisper. Cypher, the fourth city, is better documented, but mainly from later periods. We know it became an important cult center for the sun god Shamash, and its temple records have yielded thousands of cuneiform tablets. But its earliest layers, those that would match the pre-flood era, are buried deep beneath thousands of years of later living, difficult and expensive to reach. What lies at the bottom remains largely unexplored. Then there's Shurpak, the last city before the flood, home to Uber-Tudu, whose son Zu-Sudra survived the flood in Sumerian flood mythology. Shurpak is modern Tel Far, and it's one of the most important sites for understanding the King List structure. Digs there uncovered exactly what the text predicts: a dramatic flood layer separating earlier living from later rebuilding. Thick clean mud left by disaster flooding, marking a clear break in cultural continuity. Above the flood layer, the city was rebuilt. Smaller, different, but recognizably continuing some traditions from before. Below the flood layer, older buildings, different pottery styles, evidence of a thriving city center that met sudden disaster. The King List says kingship ended at Shurpak before the flood swept over. The ground confirms that something ended there violently, decisively. But here's what haunts these sites. Beneath the earliest levels of writing, beneath the first cuneiform tablets and business records, there are always older layers, deeper levels of human activity going back thousands of years before the Sumerians learned to write. At Eridu, those pre-writing levels show smart temple building. At Shurpak, pre-flood layers reveal city planning, specialized labor, long-distance trade networks. These were complex societies with organized religion, money systems, and building knowledge. Yet, they left no words, or rather they left no words that survived. Writing requires specific materials and storage conditions. Clay tablets last, but earlier records, if they existed, might have been kept on materials that rot. Wood, leather, bark, woven fiber. Any of these would have rotted away thousands of years ago, leaving no trace of the knowledge they contained. So, we're left with a paradox. Digging evidence of cultural smartness in the very cities the King lists names as pre-flood centers of kingship, but no text to tell us what those cultures called themselves, how they organized time, or what they believed. The silence feels heavy, like standing in a library after a fire, surrounded by the building evidence that books once existed, but unable to read a single sentence. What kind of culture builds temples, aligns them to space, keeps them up across centuries, develops city centers and trade routes, yet leaves no language record? Were they pre-writing, truly operating without writing, or did their records simply not survive the disasters that left those flood layers and burnt ruins? The King List suggests memory lasted even when text didn't. The Sumerian scribes who put it together claimed to know the sequence of kingship going back before writing, before the flood, into ages their own ancestors could barely put into words. Perhaps that's what temple rebuilding represents. Building memory. Each generation at Eridu rebuilding the shrine in the same sacred spot wasn't just honoring tradition. They were encoding continuity. The temple itself became the text. Its placement and lasting declaring something important happened here long ago. And we remember the cities named in the King List aren't legendary fantasy locations invented to impress later audiences. They're real places with digging depth going far back into the pre-writing past. The King List remembers them correctly as ancient, as foundational, as centers of something. Call it kingship, call it cosmic order, call it civilization authority that came before the written record. But there's a troubling edge to this. The King List assigns these cities rules lasting tens of thousands of years. Even with the most generous digging time order, we can only push city living at these sites back maybe 8,000 years, not 28,000 or 36,000. Unless the numbers don't mean what we think they mean. Unless they're encoding something other than past time, perhaps cycles, perhaps space epochs, perhaps cultural phases, that the scribes understood differently than we do, or unless the digging record itself is incomplete. We've dug only a fraction of Mesopotamia. Entire regions remain unexplored. Coastal areas that might have held earlier settlements are now underwater, drowned by the same sea level rise that came with the end of the Ice Age. The deeper we dig, the older the living we find. But there's always a limit to how deep we can go before we hit water tables or clean soil, or the practical limits of digging, funding, and technology. The King List remembers these cities as seats of cosmic kingship in ages so distant they had to be measured in space units. Digging confirms they're truly ancient, lived in for thousands of years before writing appears, keeping cultural and religious continuity across vast stretches of time. But memory runs deeper than objects. The absence of text doesn't mean absence of knowledge. And if these pre-flood cities really did save traditions from earlier epochs that ended in the disasters recorded as flood layers, then perhaps what survived wasn't written records, but something more lasting: oral tradition, ritual practice, sacred geography, and the slow, patient work of rebuilding temples on the same spot century after century, keeping connection to something that came before. If the ground remembers more than we can read, could other cultures have saved the same ages in a different language? The Sumerian King List shows a specific pattern. Divine or semi-divine rulers governing for vast epochs, then disaster flood, then human-scale kingship. Starting again in a smaller world. It's a strange enough structure on its own. But when you start looking at other ancient traditions, cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries of development, you find the same pattern repeating, not similar. Identical in structure, even when the details differ. Consider Egypt. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt developed one of the world's earliest writing systems, and kept careful records of royal succession. Egyptian King Lists stretch back through family history with careful precision, names, rule lengths, accomplishments. But the oldest of these lists don't begin with human pharaohs. The Turin Papyrus, put together during the New Kingdom around 1300 BC, starts its time order with gods Ra, Shu, Jeb, Osiris, Set, Horus. The great gods of the Egyptian religion are listed not as mythological beings, but as actual rulers, each ruling for thousands of years. Then come the Shamsu-Hor, the followers of Horus, semi-divine beings who ruled for shorter but still impossibly long periods. Only after these divine and semi-divine family lines does the papyrus transition to human pharaohs with recognizable rule lengths and historical proof. The structure is unmistakable. Cosmic rulers with vast roles, transitional figures, human kings with normal lifespans, the same pattern as the Sumerian King List, just dressed in Egyptian mythological vocabulary. Manetho, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek around 300 BC, saves similar traditions. His history of Egypt begins with gods ruling for 13,900 years, followed by demigods and spears ruling for another 11,000 years, before the first human family line comes around 3100 BC. These are poetic flourishes. They're shown as time order, the same business impulse that drives the Sumerian text. And like the King List, they treat the transition from divine to human rule as a basic break in historical continuity, a shift from one mode of existence to another. Halfway around the world, Hindu cosmology shows an even more complex system of vast time cycles. The concept of yugas divides cosmic time into 4 descending ages, each representing a steady decline from an original perfection. The Satya Yuga, or Golden Age, lasts 1,728,000 years, a period of perfect goodness when humans lived for thousands of years and had natural knowledge. The Treta Yuga lasts 1,296,000 years. The Dvapara Yuga 864,000 years, and the current Kali Yuga, the Age of Darkness and Confusion, lasts 432,000 years. Notice those numbers again. Multiples of the same base 60 mathematics that structures the Sumerian King List. 432,000, 864,000. These are star-based calculations suggesting either shared math traditions or coming together systems for encoding cosmic time. Between these ages, the world goes through disaster renewal. And central to this renewal is the figure of Manu, the progenitor who survives the flood to repopulate the earth. In the Matsya Purana and other texts, Manu is warned by a divine fish, an avatar of Vishnu, that a great flood will destroy the world. He builds a boat, gathers seeds and animals, and saves the knowledge necessary to restart civilization after the waters go down. The parallels to flood stories in Mesopotamia are obvious. Both feature divinely warned survivors, boats, saving of life and knowledge, and the concept of civilization rebooting after total disaster. But the Hindu version puts this story within a larger framework of cyclical time where floods mark the transitions between cosmic ages, rather than single historical events. This cyclical understanding appears in Greek tradition as well, though in compressed form. Hesiod's works and Days, written around 700 BC, describes 5 successive ages of humanity: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. The Golden Age was ruled by Chronos, a time when humans lived like gods, free from hard work and suffering with lifespans going on indefinitely. The Silver Age declined in goodness and length of life. The Bronze Age grew more violent. The Heroic Age produced the great warriors of Greek mythology. And the Iron Age, Hesiod's present, represents the lowest point. Short lives, constant struggle, moral decay. Each age ends in destruction. And between the Bronze Age and the present era comes Deucalion's flood. The Greek flood myth where Zeus decides to destroy corrupt humanity with water. Only Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive by building a boat, eventually repopulating the world by throwing stones that turn into people. Again, the pattern: long ages of semi-divine existence, moral decline, disaster, flood, new reduced age of ordinary humans. The same structure adjusted for Greek cultural context. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in cultures that developed entirely separately from Old World civilizations, we find the exact same time framework. Aztec and Maya cosmology records multiple suns or world ages, each lasting thousands of years and each ending in cosmic destruction. The first sun was destroyed by jaguars eating humanity. The second sun ended when humans were turned into monkeys by hurricanes. The third sun was consumed by rain of fire. The fourth sun, and this is important, was destroyed by flood with survivors turning into fish. We're currently living in the fifth sun, which began after the flood, and which will eventually end in earthquakes. Each sun represents a complete world cycle: creation, development, disaster, renewal. And like the other traditions, human lifespans and abilities get smaller with each successive age. The Maya long count calendar similarly organizes time into vast cycles called Bactans, approximately 394 years each, which combine into longer periods stretching across thousands of years. The famous 2012 date marked the end of the 13th Bactan. Not the end of the world, but the completion of a major cycle and the beginning of another. These systems share more than just a sense of deep time. They share a specific structure. Stage 1, an earlier, better age when humans or prehumans lived vastly longer, had greater knowledge or goodness, and existed under divine or semi-divine rule. Stage 2, steady decline or corruption across successive ages. Stage 3, disaster, destruction, most commonly flood, but sometimes fire, wind, or other elemental forces. Stage 4, a new beginning with reduced human ability, shorter lives, harder conditions. Fragmentary knowledge of what came before. This isn't just a general golden age nostalgia common to many cultures. The specificity of the pattern, the number precision, the flood as reset mechanism, the transition from cosmic to human time scales, suggests something more structured than coincidental myth-making. So we face a question: is this coming together or inheritance? The expert agreement tends toward independent development. Humans across cultures naturally create origin stories. Naturally look to the past as better than the present, naturally use flood disasters which happen regularly in river valleys and coastal regions as dramatic story punctuation. The similarities in this view reflect universal patterns of human imagination, rather than shared historical memory. But there's an alternative interpretation, one that takes these traditions more literally. What if cultures separated by oceans all remember long ages and disaster resets? Because those ages and resets actually happened. What if the pattern repeats not because it's psychologically universal, but because it's historically true, saved in different mythological languages, but pointing to the same underlying time order? This idea faces obvious challenges. How would such memory move across isolated cultures? Why would it survive in myth, but not in clear historical record? And what kind of event could be both global enough to affect every civilization and disastrous enough to require complete cultural rebooting? Yet the math precision is hard to dismiss. The Sumerian SAR units appearing in Hindu Yuga calculations, the base 60 thinking underlying both Mesopotamian and Indian cosmic time orders. The shared use of flood as the primary reset mechanism. These aren't vague similarities. They're structural identities. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between pure coincidence and direct transmission. Perhaps there was a shared inheritance, a common Neolithic or even Paleolithic framework for understanding time and disaster that came before the development of separate civilizations. As cultures split apart geographically and linguistically, they saved this framework in their own mythological vocabularies, but the underlying structure stayed recognizable. Or perhaps something more unsettling. Perhaps the pattern repeats because the events it describes are truly cyclical. Not just one flood, but multiple disasters separated by thousands of years. Not just one golden age, but recurring peaks of cultural smartness stopped by environmental collapse, each saved in the mythological memory of whoever survived to rebuild. The Sumerian King List stops being an isolated oddity when placed alongside these global parallels. It becomes one voice in a worldwide chorus, all singing variations of the same song. There were ages before this one. They lasted longer than ours. They ended in disaster. We are living in the aftermath trying to remember what was lost. As so many cultures remember long ages and world resets, what kind of disaster could erase an entire time period and yet leave its shadow and stories? If cultures around the world independently remember disaster floods marking the end of earlier ages, we should ask, is there a rock event large enough, recent enough, and traumatic enough to have left such widespread memory? The answer is yes. And it's not guesswork. It's recorded in ice cores, ocean floor deposits, and drowned coastlines around the world. Between roughly 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, Earth went through one of the most dramatic climate changes in human history, the end of the last ice age. Massive ice sheets that had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia began melting as global temperatures rose. The water locked in those glaciers, enough to lower sea levels by approximately 120 meters, returned to the oceans. That's not a slow rise. It's a transformation of the world map. Coastlines that had been dry land for tens of thousands of years. Places where humans lived, built, traded, developed cultures vanished beneath rising waters. River valleys flooded, deltas drowned, entire continental shelves disappeared, taking with them any digging evidence of whoever lived there. The process wasn't smooth. While the overall warming trend lasted thousands of years, the meltwater didn't drain steadily. It came in pulses, disaster releases when ice dams failed, sending massive amounts of water surging into the oceans within years or even months. These meltwater pulses are recorded in ocean deposit cores as sudden spikes in freshwater indicators, marking moments when sea levels jumped by meters in a geological instant. One of the most studied examples is the Black Sea flood idea. Today, the Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow Bosporus Strait. But around 7,600 years ago, well within the range of human memory and early farming societies, that connection might not have existed. Rock experts Ryan and Pittman proposed in the 1980s that the Black Sea was originally a much smaller freshwater lake sitting well below sea level. As Mediterranean waters rose at the end of the Ice Age, they eventually broke through the natural barrier at the Bosporus. The resulting flood would have been disastrous. Water pouring through at volumes 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, raising the lake level by meters per day, flooding thousands of square kilometers of Liverpool shoreline within months. The idea remains debated. Some evidence supports it. Other data suggests a more gradual connection, but the basic fact is undeniable. The Black Sea region experienced dramatic water level changes that would have displaced any coastal populations living there. And this happened within the time frame when farming was spreading, when complex societies were forming, when cultural memory could believably save trauma on that scale. Similar disasters happened elsewhere. In North America, the draining of glacial lake gases sent massive freshwater floods down the Mississippi and into the Arctic Ocean, possibly disrupting ocean circulation and triggering climate shifts. In Europe, meltwater carved new river channels and reshaped entire drainage systems. But the most haunting losses are the landscapes that simply disappeared. Places that were above water for the entire span of human thinking development then vanished. Doggerland, for instance. For most of the Ice Age, what is now the North Sea between Britain and continental Europe was dry land, a lallying plain of rivers, lakes, and forests where hunter-gatherers lived for thousands of years. Fishing nets occasionally pull up stone tools, carved bone, and even pieces of settlements from the ocean floor. Then, around 8,000 years ago, rising waters and a possible tsunami from a massive underwater landslide off Norway's coast submerged the region entirely. Anyone living there either drowned or fled to higher ground, carrying only what they could save and their memories of a world beneath the waves. Sunderland shows an even more dramatic loss. During the Ice Age, Southeast Asia extended much further south. The islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand were connected by a vast continental shelf that doubled the region's livable land area. As seas rose, this entire landscape flooded, breaking the once continuous territory into the island group we see today. Genetic and language evidence suggests this region was a major center of early human cultural development. What knowledge vanished when those coastlines drowned? The Mediterranean tells similar stories. Coastal caves that were once livable now open underwater. Ancient shorelines lie dozens of meters beneath current sea level. Everywhere humans would naturally have settled. River mouths, fertile coastal plains, natural harbors, now sits under salt water and deposit. We're not talking about minor adjustments. We're talking about the most desirable real estate for early human cultures, coastal zones with access to ocean resources. River valleys with fertile soil, meeting points where trade routes naturally formed, all erased within the span of a few thousand years. Fast enough to be disastrous for the societies experiencing it, slow enough to be invisible in the digging record, unless you're specifically looking for drowned sites. And who looks for what they don't know is missing. Meanwhile, something remarkable appears in the digging record right at this boundary between the Ice Age and the modern climate. Almost as if disaster triggered a response. Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey dates to approximately 11,000 years ago, placing it right at the end of the last major meltwater pulses. It's a massive stone complex of shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles, some weighing over 10 tons, carved with detailed reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. What makes it amazing is the context. This was built by people who supposedly hadn't yet invented farming or settled communities. The usual story says hunter-gatherers were too mobile, too focused on survival to invest in monument building. Yet here's undeniable evidence of organized labor, smart stonework, space knowledge. The pillars are aligned to sky events and symbolic communication, all coming before farming by at least 1,000 years. Göbekli Tepe looks less like a beginning and more like a memory marker. The careful act of saving by people who had seen massive environmental change and wanted to encode something permanent before the knowledge disappeared. The site was intentionally buried around 8000 BC, carefully covered with soil as if protecting it for a future that might understand its importance. And it's not alone. Across Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent, similar sites are coming out of earlier periods. Karahan Tepe, Neval-1 Kori, others, suggesting a widespread tradition of stone building that comes before everything we thought we knew about civilization's origins. These sites cluster in regions that would have been safe areas, higher ground away from flooding coastlines, areas where displaced populations might have moved as their original homelands drowned. The timing is suggestive. Massive climate disaster, then sudden appearance of monument building, encoding space knowledge in stone. Mesopotamia sits at the receiving end of this story. The Tigris and Euphrates river valleys would have been obvious destinations for anyone fleeing rising waters along the Persian Gulf coast. As seas rose, the Gulf pushed inland, flooding what had been extensive coastal plains. Communities living there would have moved upstream, settling in the river valleys that would eventually become Sumer. And what did those settlers say about their origins? That kingship descended from heaven. That knowledge came from before the flood. That they were restoring what had been, not inventing what was new. The language of restoration appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts. Temple writings describe rebuilding on ancient foundations. King lists trace authority back across the flood to earlier times. Creation myths speak of gods ordering the cosmos from primordial chaos, which might be mythological encoding of cultural rebuilding after disaster displacement. This reframes the Sumerian Kamingap around 3500 BC, not as civilization suddenly generating in Mesopotamia, but as the latest visible layer of something older, the point at which displaced knowledge finally found stable enough conditions and sufficient population density to crystallize into cities, writing and permanent records. The smartness makes more sense in this context. The fully formed writing, the advanced astronomy, the base 60 mathematics, the city planning, these don't look like inventions if they're inheritances. They look like knowledge saved through an age of instability, finally finding expression once again in monument building and permanent texts. The flood layers found as Shurpak and other Sumerian sites might not be memories of the larger Ice Age floods. Those happened too early, too slowly, but they could be memories of later regional disasters that echoed the earlier trauma. Or they could mark the moment when rising groundwater from sea level stabilization finally reached critical levels in Mesopotamian river valleys, causing devastating floods that reminded survivors of older stories about when the seas swallowed the world. Cultural memory works in layers. A disastrous flood experience firsthand blends with inherited stories of earlier floods, reinforced by rock evidence visible in the landscape, old shorelines high above current water levels, ocean deposits far inland, submerged forests visible at low tide. Each generation adds its own experience to the built-up memory, until the distinction between recent flood and ancient flooding blurs into a single story. The flood that ended the world before this one. The Sumerian King List. In this reading becomes an attempt to keep time order across that break to say yes, there was disaster. Yes, the world changed. But we remember what came before. We remember how long those ages lasted. We remember the cities where kingship existed. And we are the rightful heirs of that lost order. If waves in time erase the coastlines of an earlier civilization, who carried its memory inland into the hands of the first scribes of Sumer? There's something unusual about the Sumerian language itself, something that deepens the mystery of how their knowledge appeared so suddenly and completely. Sumerian is a language orphan. It has no known relatives. No parent language. We can trace it back to no descendant languages that evolved from it. Akkadian, which eventually replaced it in daily use, belongs to the Semitic family, related to Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic. But Sumerian stands alone, unconnected to any other known language family on Earth. This isolation is rare enough to be suspicious. Most languages leave traces of their origins, loan words from neighboring tongues, grammar strictures inherited from old forms, cognates that reveal Historical connections. Sumerian has none of this. It appears in the earliest texts as a fully developed language with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary and smart ability for abstract thought. There's no Proto-Sumerian, no simplified earlier version we can point to and say here's where it was still forming. The first Sumerian tablets we have dating to around 3200 BC already show language maturity, and they're written in a script that's equally sudden in its arrival. Cuneiform writing appears suddenly around 3200 BC, coming out of a brief period of picture-based notation used for basic accounting. Within a few generations, those simple pictures had changed into a complex system of wedge-shaped marks, capable of expressing not just objects and numbers, but abstract concepts, grammar relationships, poetry, law, and mythology. The earliest form tablets aren't experimental. They're standardized. The same signs appear at sites across Mesopotamia. Uruk, Kish suggesting the system was already set up and shared, not developing independently in each location. That means either rapid spreading from a single source or the making official of something that had been gestating in non-written form for much longer than the digging record shows. Writing systems usually evolve slowly. Egyptian hieroglyphs took centuries to develop from picture representation to sound smartness. Chinese characters show a long evolution from oracle bone writings to standardized forms. Mesoamerican scripts have visible developmental stages. Cuneiform doesn't follow this pattern. It arrives nearly complete, as if the concept of writing not just this particular script, but the basic idea of encoding language in visible symbols, was already understood before the first clay tablet was pressed. This brings us to the scribes themselves, the guardians of this sudden knowledge. Sumerian scribes weren't just copiers. They were elite specialists trained in temple schools, called Adaba tablet houses, where education was hard, hierarchical and deeply conservative. Students spent years memorizing sign lists, practicing tablet after tablet until their cuneiform was flawless. They copied ancient texts repeatedly, not to create new works, but to save old ones. The curriculum was designed around transmission, not innovation. Master texts, official works of literature, mathematics, law, and ritual, were copied exactly, with scribes competing to produce the most faithful copies. Any difference was correction, not creativity. This obsessive faithfulness to precedent reveals how scribes understood their role not as creators, but as savers. They were record keepers in a civilization that believed its most important knowledge already existed, and needed only to be protected from time's erosion. Even after Sumerian stopped being spoken, replaced by Akkadian around 2000 BC as the common language, it stayed the language of scholarship and ritual for another 1,500 years. Dead as a living tongue, but alive in temples and schools, Sumerian worked like Latin in medieval Europe, a sacred medium through which older wisdom could be accessed, a language bridge to knowledge considered more authoritative than contemporary understanding. Why keep a dead language unless what's written in it is irreplaceable? And what the scribes wrote again and again was the language of restoration. Temple writings routinely describe rebuilding on the foundations of old, restoring shrines to their original form, and renewing kingship as it was before. These aren't just pious phrases. They reflect a worldview in which the present gets legitimacy from correctly copying the past. When writing from the Ur-3 period states, I rebuilt the temple of Enki at Eridu, which had been founded in ancient days, established by an Enlil. I restored it to its place. Not I built, but I restored. Not a new creation, but the renewal of something that had existed previously. The Sumerian King List fits perfectly within this scribal thinking. It's not entertainment or propaganda. It's a keeping project, an attempt to organize time memory going beyond the reach of living tradition put together from whatever sources the scribes had access to. Older king lists, temple records, oral traditions, space tables, family fragments. Different versions of the king list survive, and they show slight differences. Some include cities, others leave them out. Some give different rule links for the same king. This variability suggests the text was put together and re-put together over centuries, with scribes working from multiple sources that didn't always agree, trying to create a clear time order from fragmentary materials. But across all versions the basic structure stays constant. Pre-flood kings with cosmic rules, the flood as dividing line. Post-flood kings with steadily shorter rules. That consistency points to an underlying template. The framework the scribes inherited and saved even when they couldn't fully explain its logic. They were ordering time according to principles they might not have invented themselves. The base 60 mathematics, the SAR units encoding space cycles, the pre-flood post-flood division, the specific cities named as primordial centers. All of this suggests the king list saves a time order system older than the scribes who wrote it down. Think about what that means. The first written version of the king list dates to around 2100 BC. But it describes events supposedly happening 241,200 plus years earlier. Even if we interpret those numbers as encoded time periods rather than literal years, we're still talking about the text claiming to save memory from deep time from ages before Sumerian civilization existed in recognizable form. The scribes had no reason to invent this structure. If they wanted to glorify their kings, they could have claimed unbroken divine kingship going infinitely backward with no disastrous stop. If they wanted to explain Sumerian origins, they could have created a straightforward foundation myth like other cultures did. Instead, they created or saved a document that shows human history as not continuous, stopped by disaster, operating on different time scales before and after a great flood. They encoded it in space mathematics. They anchored it to real cities with digging depth, and they treated it with the same record-keeping seriousness they brought to property records and ritual texts. Why go to such effort unless they believed they were saving something true, something that came before their own understanding, but was too important to let slip into forgetting? The King List reads like a compressed archive, a shortened version of a much longer time record that no longer exists in full. The pre-flood section might represent dozens or hundreds of lost tablets summarized into essential data points. Which centers held authority for how long? In what order? The post-flood section slowly expands as the historical record becomes richer and more detailed. More sources survive from more recent periods. So, the time order naturally grows more detailed. This is record-keeping logic, not mythological fancy. The scribes were doing what record-keepers have always done, organizing broken information into clear structure, making judgment calls about how to make conflicting sources agree, saving what they could, even when they didn't fully understand its original context. But they were saving according to a template. And that template raises questions they couldn't answer any more than we can. Why does a pre-flood time order use space units? Because that's how time was measured in whatever sources they drew from. Why does a flood mark such a sharp break? Because their sources, textual, oral, building, geological, all agreed that something basic changed at that boundary. The scribes weren't inventing a timeline. They were keeping continuity with a time framework handed down to them from earlier generations, who had received it from earlier generations. Still, going back toward the very disaster the King List describes. In this reading, Sumerian scribes become less like mythmakers and more like people who dig up memory, digging through inherited fragments, trying to rebuild a clear picture of what came before, saving it in the most lasting medium they had. Wedge marks in clay. What happens if we stop reading the Sumerian King List as biography and start reading it as a map? What if we've been reading the Sumerian King List wrong this entire time? Not wrong in the sense of mistranslation. The cuneiform is clear enough, but wrong in our basic assumption about what kind of document it is. We've treated it as biography, a list of individual rulers with impossibly inflated lifespans. But what if it was never meant to be read that way? What if each king listed before the flood doesn't represent a person, but an epoch, a phase of time, a world age, an era defined by particular conditions and centered in particular places? What if the king list is less a family tree and more a map, not of territory, but of time itself? This reframing changes everything. Look again at the structure. 8 pre-flood entries, each connected with a city, each assigned a specific duration measured in multiples of 3,600. The Sumerian SAR and space unit used to track sky cycles. Alulum of Eridu 28,800 years equals 8 SAR. Alunga of Eridu 36,000 years 10 SAR. And Luana of Bat Tubira 43,200 years 12 SAR. These aren't biographical claims. They're time coordinates. Each entry marks a separate phase in a longer time order measured in cosmic intervals, rather than human lifetimes. The kings are labels, names attached to ages the way we might name rock periods, Jurassic, Cretaceous, or historical eras, Bronze Age, Iron Age. The Sumerians organized their deepest past according to the same principles they used for astronomy. Base 60 mathematics, cyclical thinking, and the assumption that earthly affairs reflected sky patterns. If planetary cycles could be measured in SAR units, why not world ages? This interpretation makes the numbers make sense. Instead of dismissing 28,800 years as mythological exaggeration, we read it as the time period associated with Alulum at Eridu lasted 8 cosmic cycles. The precision isn't biographical inflation. It's time notation. And the cities, they aren't just the mythical birthplaces of impossible rulers. They're centers of continuity, locations where cultural authority existed during particular time periods, where knowledge was kept, where the thread of civilization held even as conditions changed around it. Consider the sequence Eridu, Bat Tubir, Larak, Cyper, Shurpak. This isn't random geography. It traces a movement across southern Mesopotamia. Each city representing a shift in where cultural centrality existed across vast stretches of time. Perhaps environmental changes, shifting river courses, regional climate changes, resource availability caused populations to move, carrying their traditions and authority structures to new centers. Eridu, the first city, sits at what was once the edge of the Persian Gulf. During earlier, wetter periods of the Holocene, this region would have been prime territory, coastal access, fertile hinterland, trade routes. As climate shifted and coastlines changed, the center of gravity might have moved inland to Bat Tubir, then to other cities as conditions continued changing. Each city named in the pre-flood section has real digging depth, living layers going back thousands of years before writing. Evidence of long-term cultural continuity, sacred building kept up across centuries. The King List remembers them correctly as ancient centers, even if the time frames it assigns operate on a scale we're still struggling to decode. The time periods themselves, those 8, 10, and 12 SAR intervals, might match observable cycles, climate shifts measurable in ice cores and pollen records, space configurations that ancient observers track carefully, or simply cultural phases that later Sumerians grouped into manageable units when trying to organize inherited time order. We don't need the numbers to be literally accurate for them to be functionally meaningful. They're doing what all time systems do, dividing continuous time into separate, labeled segments so it can be discussed, remembered, and transmitted. The time periods aren't precise measurements. They're organizing categories, saving the basic structure of a much longer sequence. Then comes the flood. Then the flood swept over. This single line works as the hard reset in the time order. Everything changes here. The cosmic clockwork stops. The carefully measured SAR intervals end. And when kingship descends from heaven again, it does so in an entirely different way. The flood isn't incidental to the King List structure. It's the central organizing principle, the axis around which the entire document pivots. Before it, deep time, cosmic cycles, time periods measured by space. After it, compressed time, human scale rules, history as we recognize it. Rockwise, this makes sense. The end of the Ice Age brought disastrous environmental change. Sea levels rising 120 meters over several thousands of years. Meltwater pulses triggering regional floods. Coastlines drowning. River systems reshaping. Entire landscapes transforming. Any culture experiencing this would understand history as divided between before the waters came and after the waters went down. Myth-wise, the pattern repeats globally. Every tradition remembering long ages ending in flood followed by smaller conditions. The King List encodes the same memory in Mesopotamian cultural vocabulary. Digging-wise, flood layers appear in Sumerian cities at boundaries between cultural phases. Physical evidence of break that matches the text story break. The flood in the King List isn't one event. It's the compression of multiple disasters into a single time marker, the way we might say the fall of Rome to mark a transition that actually unfolded over centuries. It represents the boundary between whatever cultural continuity existed in earlier time periods and the new phase that began when survivors regrouped, rebuilt, and started recording their history in more familiar terms. After the flood, something shifts in the King List's focus. The map zooms in. The scale changes from cosmic to political. Rules shrink from tens of thousands of years to thousands, then hundreds, then decades. Cities become recognizable family lines. Kish, Urukut kings. We can sometimes prove through other sources, monuments we've dug up, writings we've translated. This is the transition from epic time to human time, from ages measured in sky cycles to generations measured. The lifetimes. The King List moves from mapping world ages to cataloging political succession, from saving cosmic time order to documenting historical business. But notice the scribes don't treat these two sections as basically different types of information. They use the same format, the same record-keeping tone, the same time structure. To them, both sections are history. One distant and encoded in space language, the other recent and expressed in conventional terms, but both part of a continuous timeline they're obligated to save. This is what makes the King List so strange and so valuable. It's trying to keep time continuity across a break so severe it changed how time itself could be measured and recorded. It's an attempt to say yes, the world as we know it began after disaster, but there was something before and we remember its structure, even if we can no longer fully understand its scale. The King List in this reading isn't the full story. It's the index to a story mostly lost. The compressed summary of a much longer time archive that once existed in some form, but didn't survive the disasters it describes. What we have is the skeletal outline, the framework, the essential data points that let scribes keep time direction, even after the detailed records vanished. Think of it as the table of contents to a library that burned. You can see the organization, which sections came in what order, how long each was, what topics they covered, but the actual content, the stories and details that would make the timeline fully understandable are gone. The King List saves the structure of knowledge without saving the knowledge itself. This explains why it feels at the same time precise and unclear. Precise because it's built on real-time thinking. Base 60 mathematics, space cycles, geographical movement, unclear, because we're reading a summary designed for an audience who had access to contexts we lack. Oral traditions, ritual. Knowledge, space frameworks that made the encoded information immediately meaningful. The Sumerian scribes who put this together weren't inventing ancient history. They were keeping it, working from pieces of older time orders, making sources that didn't always align agree, trying to keep time order across a civilization break that had erased most of the supporting evidence. They succeeded in saving the structure. 2-year timeline, flood as divider, cosmic time periods giving way to human history. But the mechanism, exactly what those time periods represented, why those particular cities mattered, what events the space numbers encoded, faded as the cultural context supporting their interpretation disappeared. We're left reading a map whose legend is missing. We can see the shapes, the relationships, the careful organization. We can recognize it as a map. But where exactly it's pointing, what territories it charts, that requires rebuilding, inference, comparison with other sources, and acknowledgement that some answers might be permanently lost. If the Sumerian King List is just one surviving page of a much older map, then where does that leave us? Living at the end of a story we barely remember. Night falls over the museum, the lights dim in the halls where ancient objects rest behind glass, and the Sumerian King List sits in silence, just a small clay tablet covered in wedge-shaped marks, easily overlooked among grander monuments and golden treasures. But if you pause there in the quiet, if you let your eyes adjust to the dimness and trace those impressed lines, you can almost feel the weight of what it carries. Not the physical weight of baked clay, but the time weight of everything it's trying to save. Time periods measured in sky cycles, cities that stood for thousands of years, the boundary between ages, the memory of a world that drowned. Thousands of years separate us from the scribe who pressed those marks into wet clay. Thousands more separate that scribe from the events or time periods or ages the text describes. And yet here it remains, breathing quietly in the dark, holding its time order like a heartbeat from another world. We spend these hours walking through what the King List might be telling us. And in doing so, we've had to reconsider some comfortable assumptions about our place in history. We like to think of human civilization as a steady upward climb, primitive beginnings slowly improving through innovation and built-up knowledge until we arrive at our current smartness. The story is linear. Hunter-gatherers to farmers, villages to cities, superstition to science, ignorance to enlightenment. Each generation building on what came before. Progress adding up across thousands of years. It's a comforting story. It makes us the peak of everything that came before, the apex of a long developmental arc. But the Sumerian King List suggests something different. It suggests cycles, rather than lines. Ages that rise and fall. Knowledge that can be lost as well as gained, civilizations that reset, leaving only fragments for whoever comes after to puzzle over. In this view, our timeline, the history we're confident about, the digging we've documented, the 5,000 years of writing we can read, might be just the latest layer, not the first. Sumer's importance wouldn't be that it invented civilization, but that it was the first culture after the last major reset to develop. Writing lasting enough to save memory across further disasters. The Sumerians themselves seemed to understand this. They spoke constantly of restoration, of rebuilding what was before, of kingship descending rather than originating. Their scribes carefully saved the King Lists not as propaganda but as time order, a framework for understanding time that went far beyond living memory, encoding time periods in space mathematics, because that was the only language capable of expressing such depths. They saw themselves as heirs, not pioneers, inheritors of something older, responsible for keeping continuity, even when the full context had been lost. This creates a different relationship with the past, one that acknowledges how much can vanish. Coastlines drown, taking their settlements with them. Languages die, making entire libraries unreadable. Climate shifts forcing migrations that cut cultural continuity. Fire, flood, conquest, and simple neglect erase the built-up knowledge of centuries and moments. We experience this forgetting ourselves, just on shorter time scales. Medieval Europeans forgot how Romans built aqueducts and roads. The secrets of Damascus steel vanished. The method for creating Stradivarius violins remains debated. Even recent knowledge, the Saturn V rocket plans, early computer code, traditional farming techniques, disappears when the people who held it die without adequate transmission. Scale that up across thousands of years, across multiple disastrous climate shifts, across the drowning of entire continental shelves where early humans lived, and the idea of deep cultural forgetting stops seeming far-fetched. Maybe the King List isn't describing impossible prehistory. Maybe it's describing precisely what we'd expect. Fragmentary memory of earlier phases saved imperfectly encoded in whatever frameworks made sense to the scribes doing the saving. Keeping just enough structure to say something came before without being able to fully rebuild what that something was. This isn't proof of Atlantis or ancient astronauts or any specific lost civilization. The King List doesn't give us that kind of certainty. What it gives us is something more valuable. Permission to question whether our historical timeline is as complete as we've assumed. It opens space for acknowledging how much we don't know. How much of human experience happened in contexts that left minimal digging traces? Coastal settlements now underwater. Wooden structures that rotted away, oral traditions that died with their speakers, knowledge systems encoded in materials that rotted practices rather than stone and clay. The King List reminds us that ancient people were smart observers of astronomy, climate, time, disaster, and that their ways of organizing and transmitting knowledge might have been different from ours, but not necessarily less valid. When they said civilization was older than we can easily measure, when they structured Time in cosmic cycles, when they remembered ages before the flood, perhaps they were working from frameworks we've lost access to, rather than simply making things up. And perhaps what we call discovery is sometimes actually remembrance, finding again what was once known. Reconnecting with patterns and principles that earlier cultures had put into words in their own languages. Rediscovering principles encoded in monuments, myths, and math systems. We're only now learning to read correctly. Every dig that pushes human smartness further back in time. Göbekli Tepe space alignments at 11,000 years ago. Evidence of long-distance trade networks and the Paleolithic math knowledge built into ancient buildings suggests our ancestors were far more capable than we've given them credit for. And if they were that capable, what did they know that we've forgotten? The King List won't answer that question definitively. It's too fragmentary, too encoded, too distant from our own frameworks of understanding. But it holds space for the question. It suggests that our history begins not at the dawn of civilization, but somewhere in the middle, after the last major reset, after the floods that ended the Ice Age, after whatever cultural continuity existed before was broken and had to be painfully rebuilt. We're living in the aftermath, in the rebuilding phase, piecing together what we can from fragments, and trying to understand what the fragments are pointing toward. Maybe that's why these ancient texts still whisper to us across thousands of years. They remind us that we're not separate from the deep past. We're continuous with it. Shaped by disasters we barely remember. Inheritors of knowledge we only half understand. Participants in cycles that go far beyond the scope of recorded history. Outside, beyond the museum walls, the same stars that Sumerian astronomers tracked with such precision still wheel across the darkness. The same math. Relationship space 60 × 360-degree circle space cycles still structure how we measure existence. The same clay that held wedge marks 4,000 years ago still holds the impression of ancient fingers. And somewhere out in the Iraqi desert, wind moves across the ruins of Eridu, the first city, where kingship supposedly descended from heaven 8 cosmic ages ago. Dust drifts over the mound where 18 successive temples rose and fell. Each generation rebuilding on the same sacred ground. Keeping connection to something they believed was worth saving even as the world changed around them. The wedge marks in that clay tablet aren't just writing. They're intention. Someone's careful choice to press meaning into matter, to fight against forgetting, to say this happened. These ages existed. This structure matters. Remember, and we do remember, however imperfectly. We read the marks. We puzzle over the numbers. We dig up the cities. We try to rebuild what the scribes were saving. We'll never fully recover the context that made their time order immediately readable to its original audience. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the King List's greatest gift isn't answers, but questions. Not certainty about what came before, but acknowledgement that something did something vast enough, complex enough, and distant enough that it could only be encoded in cosmic mathematics, and saved through disaster by people who understood their role as guardians, rather than starters. If the Sumerian King List is a map of forgotten time periods, then when we look up at the night sky, are we seeing our future, our past, or the ruins of stories we have yet to remember? There's no final answer waiting at the end of this mystery. Just a quiet invitation to sit with uncertainty, to hold space for how much has been lost, and to wonder what else might be waiting in the spaces between what we know and what we've forgotten. Before you drift off, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what do you think the Sumerian King List really is? Mythology, encoded history, or something in between? Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe together we can remember what the scribes were trying to save. Until next time, sleep well and dream of ages we've forgotten.